The Galactic Council convened once again in a high, sterile hall that had seen countless deliberations, agreements, and, most recently, the growing sense of unease that something was amiss. Their latest decision, though, was anything but a mere debate. It was a proclamation, one that would echo across the galaxy and reshape the very foundation of their existence. But at the center of it all, one voice stood out, hesitant but unyielding. The alien war veteran. He had fought on battlefields across countless worlds, and he knew war better than anyone. His experiences, however, had led him to a singular conclusion: never, under any circumstance, provoke the human women. He was not a particularly imposing figure by alien standards. His species, a collection of angular forms and multi-layered exoskeletons, was known for its cold logic and tactical precision. But even in a room filled with towering figures and vast intellects, his reputation was undeniable. He had survived wars with species that were far more advanced, even more brutal. The stories of his survival were legendary, whispered in hushed tones across the galaxy's farthest reaches. And yet, despite everything he had witnessed, despite all the carnage he had endured, this was the one warning he could not shake. Do not underestimate human women. The Galactic Council, however, saw things differently. They had never truly understood the humans. To them, humanity was a nascent species, emotional, unpredictable, and raw. And though their male counterparts had proven themselves time and time again as formidable warriors, their women were seen as lesser beings. Their roles confined to domestic spaces, nurturing, and the occasional political maneuver, but rarely did they hold power or sway in the galaxy's military conflict. It was an assumption that had become deeply ingrained in the minds of the council members. A few brave humans, yes, had shown some signs of strength, but to go so far as to declare that human women could be formidable in warfare? It was laughable. The veteran, who had seen human women in action, knew all too well the consequences of this belief. He had fought beside them, observed them, and in some cases, been saved by them. But now, as the council prepared to pass its latest decree, sanctioning a campaign against a human colony for reasons that seemed trivial at best, he stood alone in his conviction. Do not attack human women, he implored. You do not understand them. You will regret it. The room fell silent, as it always did when he spoke. Some of the council members exchanged glances, skeptical but too proud to voice their doubts. One of the elder statesmen, a towering figure from a species known for their aggression, spoke first. You speak of human women as if they are something we should fear. But they are nothing more than inferior creatures, fragile and weak. Have you forgotten your place, veteran? The veteran's jaw clenched. He had not forgotten his place. He knew how to fight, how to command, and most importantly, how to survive. But survival meant understanding your enemy. And human women were no ordinary foe. It's not about strength, he said slowly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. It's about the things you can't measure. The intelligence, the adaptability, the willingness to fight even when all hope is lost. You will be blindsided. And when you are, you will not be able to recover. Another council member, this time a diplomat from a species known for their cunning, tilted his head thoughtfully. You've seen them fight, yes? You've fought alongside them. But you've also fought against them. Surely, you can offer us more than just vague warnings. The veteran took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. I've fought alongside them, against some of the deadliest forces in the galaxy. But human women? They are different. They don't just fight with weapons. They fight with strategy. They're resourceful. They think on their feet. And above all, they don't give up. The words hung in the air, but they were met with skepticism. The council's dismissal was palpable. After all, this was a war veteran, a seasoned soldier, and yet, here he was, insisting that human women, flesh and blood beings, could outwit entire fleets. To the council, it seemed ridiculous, but to the veteran, it was a cold, hard truth. He had witnessed firsthand the tenacity of human women in battle. He'd seen them rise from the ashes of impossible odds, their resolve unbroken, their will unyielding. He had fought beside them on the outskirts of alien empires, where their ingenuity turned the tide of battle. He knew the secrets of their power. But the Council? They saw only weakness. They saw the soft underbelly of a species they deemed beneath them. The veteran had come to this meeting to warn them, to show them the dangers of underestimating humanity's women. But as the Council continued to deliberate, the familiar ache of frustration set in. They would not listen. They had already made their decision. They would launch an assault against the human colonies, targeting key locations where women held political and military sway. They would regret it. The veteran knew it in his bones. But he couldn't stop them. Not yet. As the Council's decision was announced, the veteran's mind raced. He thought back to the times when he had seen human women in action. On one occasion, he had watched a human woman lead a ragtag group of survivors against an entire enemy battalion. Armed with nothing more than her wits and a few meager weapons, she had outflanked them, turning their own tactics against them. In another instance, he had witnessed a human woman infiltrate an enemy stronghold, using nothing but her knowledge of their language and culture to dismantle their defenses from within. The enemies, all far more powerful than her, had fallen to her sheer willpower and determination. But these were just small victories. What the Council didn't understand was that these women weren't anomalies. They were the rule. They were capable of things that no one else in the galaxy could even comprehend. As the final decision was made, the veteran's heart sank. He knew the human women would fight back, perhaps even win. But the cost would be high. It always was when you underestimated your enemy. And this time, the consequences would be far more severe than the Council could imagine. The veteran turned his back to the Council, walking out of the chamber with a heavy heart. He had done everything he could. The rest was up to fate. What followed, though, would not be easy. The galaxy would soon see a side of human women it had never imagined, a side that would send ripples through the very fabric of the Galactic Empire. It wasn't just about strength anymore. It was about survival. And in that, humanity's women would prove to be the most dangerous force the galaxy had ever encountered. The veteran's warning had been ignored. But as history would soon reveal, no one could ignore human women for long. The warning had fallen on deaf ears, and the consequences of that failure to listen began to unfold across the galaxy with terrifying speed. The Galactic Council, secure in their superiority, had underestimated the human women, believing their attack on a small human colony would be swift, easy, and decisive. But it wasn't. Not even close. The veteran watched from a distance, his heart sinking with every passing moment. He had hoped, deep down, that he was wrong, that this wouldn't spiral out of control the way he feared. But as the first waves of the invasion hit, it became clear that the human women were not the fragile, helpless beings the Council had assumed them to be. They were something else entirely. Something the galaxy had never prepared for. The initial attack was met with confusion. The invaders, composed of highly trained soldiers from various species, had expected a simple military campaign. They anticipated overwhelming human forces, minimal resistance, and an easy path to victory. What they found instead were unexpected delays, misdirections, and unorthodox tactics that left them disoriented and vulnerable. The human women, who had been dismissed by the Council as weak, had other plans. They had spent years preparing, not just for a war that had never come, but for a moment like this. They knew how to fight without brute strength. They knew how to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast any force that came their way. They knew how to adapt in the heat of battle, how to exploit weaknesses, and how to turn the tide in an instant. The veteran had seen this firsthand, but watching it unfold now, in real time, was nothing short of astonishing. The invaders had expected an easy victory, but the human women were forcing them into a war of attrition, dragging them into a fight where the rules of conventional warfare no longer applied. Human women were masters of asymmetrical warfare. They didn't need massive armies or advanced weaponry to win, they only needed the right tools, the right knowledge, and the right mindset. And they had all of those in abundance. Guerrilla tactics, sabotage, misdirection, all of these were weapons in their arsenal. The veteran had seen them work wonders with limited resources, and now, watching them deploy those skills in the field, he understood just how deeply the Council had misunderstood humanity. It wasn't just about combat prowess. It was about their ability to see the bigger picture, to understand that the true power lay not in overwhelming force, but in the subtle, strategic movements that changed the course of a battle. In this, the human women excelled. They used their knowledge of terrain, their understanding of the enemy's psychology, and their ability to remain calm under pressure to gain an upper hand. Every attack was a calculated risk, every decision made with cold precision. They were not just soldiers, they were strategists, tacticians, and survivors. The veteran remembered one particular battle, a skirmish that had taken place on a barren moon. The human women, vastly outnumbered, had been tasked with defending a small research station. The invaders, confident in their superiority, launched an assault that seemed impossible to overcome. But the women weren't there to fight, they were there to win. They used the terrain to their advantage, luring the enemy into narrow canyons where their superior numbers became a disadvantage. The invaders, unable to adjust to the human tactics, were quickly outflanked and overwhelmed. The battle was over before it even truly began. It was the kind of victory that shattered the illusion of invincibility that so many had held over the humans. It was the kind of victory that made the veteran understand just how wrong the Council had been. Now, as the invasion of the colony continued, similar tactics played out on a larger scale. The invaders, still convinced that human women were weak, found themselves ensnared in traps they hadn't seen coming. A simple act of sabotage, cutting off supply lines, disrupting communications, poisoning water sources, was enough to cripple an entire force. What the Council had thought would be a quick military operation was turning into a nightmare of attrition, one that drained the morale of the invaders and brought them to the brink of collapse. Every victory by the human women made the situation worse for the invading forces, not just in terms of casualties, but in their ability to continue the war. They were being ground down, piece by piece, by an enemy they had underestimated. But this wasn't the end of it. The veteran knew the true test was yet to come. Human women didn't just fight for victory, they fought for survival. When cornered, they would do whatever it took to protect what they loved, what they held dear. The invasion had only served to galvanize them. The fighting wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about protecting their homes, their families, and their future. In war, there were no second chances, no time for hesitation. When the human women fought, they fought with everything they had. The veteran's gut told him that the invaders would soon face a choice: retreat or face total annihilation. But as the human forces continued to outmaneuver them, he realized that this was bigger than just a military conflict. It was a struggle for recognition, a challenge to the very notion of what it meant to be a warrior in the galaxy. The Council had wanted to show their superiority, to subjugate the human women and prove their place in the galaxy. But what they had done, inadvertently, was awaken a force that no one could control. He had hoped that the Council would realize their mistake before it was too late. But as the battles raged on, he began to fear that it might already be too late. The human women weren't just winning, they were rewriting the rules of war. What had been a simple mission to suppress a rebellious colony had now turned into a galactic conflict that could reshape the power structure of the entire galaxy. As the battle for the colony reached its peak, the veteran found himself caught between his duty to the Council and his loyalty to the human women he had come to respect. He had warned them. He had pleaded with them. But now all he could do was watch as the war unfolded, knowing that no one, not even the Council, would ever be the same after this. The human women had proven their worth. But at what cost? As the tide of battle shifted, he understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about the survival of a colony anymore. It was about the survival of the human species, and their right to be seen as equals in a galaxy that had long denied them their place. And so, the veteran watched as the invaders began to crumble, one by one, under the weight of the human women's strategy and strength. The war had begun, and though the outcome was far from certain, one thing was already clear. The galaxy would never look at human women the same way again. The lessons of underestimating them would be costly, costlier than anyone had anticipated. The invaders, initially confident in their superiority, were now on the defensive, their ranks shattered by a series of devastating defeats. But more than that, the galaxy's perception of human women was shifting. The Empire's underestimation had turned into a devastating reckoning. The Council's inability to grasp the true nature of the threat had left them floundering, scrambling to deal with a war they never expected. They had assumed that human women, confined for so long to their traditional roles, were incapable of rising to the occasion. They had believed their own propaganda, the stories that painted human women as weak, subservient, and reliant on their male counterparts. But they had underestimated the power of a species that had been pushed to the brink, a species that had seen endless adversity and still managed to rise from the ashes time and time again. The human women, though vastly outnumbered, had turned the tide in ways that no one could have predicted. They had adapted, not just to the battlefield, but to the very nature of war itself. Where the invaders relied on brute force and advanced weaponry, the human women relied on intelligence, cunning, and the kind of resourcefulness that only desperation could breed. The strategies they employed were unconventional, unexpected, and deadly. They used the terrain to their advantage, exploiting every weakness in their enemies' lines, turning every battle into a war of attrition that the invaders could not win. The human resistance had also tapped into something far deeper than military tactics, a sense of unity and purpose that no outsider could comprehend. They fought not just for survival, but for each other. They fought for their families, their homes, and their future. They fought for a chance to prove that they were more than what the Empire had assumed. In that fight they found strength in their bond, a bond that transcended any alien concept of warfare. The Council had never seen this kind of unity before. They had never seen a species willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of their women, their children, their future. The human women were fighting for their very identity, and that was a fight no one could win against them. As the war dragged on, the once proud invaders began to falter. What had seemed like a straightforward military operation now appeared to be an unwinnable conflict. Their forces, battered and broken, struggled to maintain a foothold. Supplies were dwindling, morale was collapsing, and their commanders, many of whom had underestimated the human women, began to question their initial strategies. No one had anticipated the human women's resilience, nor their ability to adapt and overcome. What had once been thought of as a small, insignificant colony now stood as a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for those who had been oppressed for far too long. It was during this time that the veteran began to see the true cost of underestimating human women. He had warned the Council, but it was too late to undo the damage. The invasion was no longer just a military conflict, it was a cultural shift. It was no longer about just winning or losing, it was about survival on a galactic scale. The Empire had underestimated an entire species, and now they were paying the price. But the cost wasn't just in resources or manpower, it was in their perception of what human women were capable of. The veteran had witnessed the transformation firsthand. He had seen human women, once relegated to the background, rise to leadership positions, commanding armies and leading resistance movements with unparalleled skill. He had watched them strategize, motivate their troops, and fight with a ferocity that put even the most battle-hardened veterans to shame. These were not the helpless creatures the Empire had assumed them to be. They were warriors, tacticians, and survivors. And the veteran, despite his own battle-hardened experiences, could only stand back in awe. The battles continued, and with each victory, the human women pushed back harder. The invaders had underestimated them, and now they were paying the price for that mistake. The resistance, which had once seemed doomed, now seemed inevitable. The invaders began to retreat, their once proud fleet limping back to their homeworlds, defeated not by superior firepower or advanced tactics, but by the sheer determination of human women who had refused to give up. But it wasn't just the military victories that were shifting the balance of power. The perception of human women across the galaxy was changing. News of their successes spread like wildfire, and soon other species began to take notice. The very idea that human women were capable of such feats began to challenge long-held beliefs about gender, strength, and power. The Empire had built its entire hierarchy on the assumption that certain species were superior, that certain races were destined to rule. But the human women were tearing that hierarchy apart, piece by piece, with every victory, with every act of defiance. As the resistance forces continued to gain ground, the veteran knew the tide had turned irreversibly. The Empire would not be able to recover from this. They had underestimated not just the military might of human women, but their very spirit. The galaxy was beginning to realize that the true power of humanity lay in its ability to adapt, to fight, and to endure. And at the center of that realization stood the human women, strong, fierce, and unyielding. The final blow came when the invaders, desperate to salvage some semblance of victory, launched an all-out assault on the human stronghold. It was a last-ditch effort, an attempt to break the back of the resistance once and for all. But the human women were ready. They had anticipated this move, had prepared for it, and when the invaders launched their attack, they were met with a response that no one could have predicted. The resistance forces, coordinated, disciplined, and determined, fought back with a ferocity that shattered the invaders' resolve. The final battle was a massacre. The invaders were crushed, their forces obliterated by a resistance that had once been underestimated but was now the most formidable force in the galaxy. In the aftermath of the battle, the veterans stood among the ruins of the enemy's final stand. The human women had won. Against all odds, they had proven that their strength was not to be measured in size or firepower but in their will to fight, to survive, and to protect. They had turned the tide of a war, shattered the Empire's illusion of superiority, and had secured their place in the galaxy's history. It was a victory that would be remembered for centuries, not just for its military significance, but for the cultural revolution it represented. The veteran had fought in countless wars, seen countless battles, and witnessed the fall of empires. But never had he seen anything like this. The human women had taken what had been denied to them for so long, respect, power, and recognition, and had forged their own path. The galaxy would never look at them the same way again. And as the dust settled, the veteran knew that the Empire's greatest mistake had not been in the war itself, but in their failure to recognize the true strength of human women. They had underestimated them once, and that, ultimately, was what led to their downfall.